Welcome, 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 or welcome back to the Data for Policy Conference 2021. This is submission number 32, and it's entitled Guidance for Countries on Leveraging Partnerships to Harness Big Data for National Sustainable Development Goal Monitoring. Thanks for attending my presentation. My name is Grant Cameron. I'm the director of SDSN Trends, which is the thematic research network on data and statistics. And it's the data arm of the UN Sustainable Development Solution Network. Trends is a global research cross-data network working on data and statistics for sustainable development. Our mandate is to join up innovators across data domains so we connect experts from, say, Earth observation and satellites with government statisticians to produce new ways data can inform development decisions. The main author of the work I'm presenting today was Dr. Cameron Allen. He's a senior advisor here at Trends, and he's also a research fellow at Monash University in Australia. Along with Cameron, myself, and research manager at Trends, Hayden Dahmm, made substantive contributions. So I'd also like to highlight, while I'm on the beginning slide, that this work was prepared with the support of Partners for Review. And you'll notice there that I've added a link to a website, and there you can find out much more about this work. Not only the full report, there's a policy brief, there's also a story map. So if you don't want to listen to me talk for the next 20 minutes, you can just sort of scoot off and check things out for yourself at www.bigdatasdgs.com. The outline of my presentation today will be as follows. I'm going to give a sort of a flash summary for those who don't have time to listen to the entire presentation to give you a sense of what we've achieved with this work. And this work is based on a thorough literature review, both of the academic and gray literature, as well as extensive interviews with individuals working with big data in national statistical offices, or individuals working in entities supporting national statistical offices with external expertise in big data. I'm going to provide a little bit of context. I'm going to provide some examples of current use of big data and SDG monitoring. And then we're going to turn to sort of really the heart of the presentation, which is really a lot more about how do you sort of join up the right kind of external expertise with statistical officers in order to sort of incorporate big data into these types of monitoring processes. And we've developed a maturity model to help us sort of align the right kind of partners with the right kind of state of maturity in these organizations. And I'm going to close with some practical steps on how to use big data as a conditioned on the maturity state of your organization. So in terms of the flash summary, there's sort of like, I guess, 5 main messages that we'd like to highlight. First of all, measuring progress on development using the SDGs as the umbrella is a really big monitoring and measuring challenge. The second thing is that I think there's an emerging consensus that big data holds promise for monitoring national progress and development progress issues. I think the third big summary point is national statisticians must partner pretty much in every circumstance with external entities to gain access to data and technical capabilities. And these partnerships work best when they're determined by a maturity model. And then finally, incorporating big data into statistical processes take more than just technical know-how from the outside. There's other types of partnerships, skills, and strategies that need to be brought to bear to inform how these production processes inside organizations are going to change. So let me now just move to the content of the context of this work. And of course, it's the big challenge of SDG monitoring. For those of you who aren't that familiar with global development objectives, the Sustainable Development Goals are a collection of 17 interlinked goals designed to be a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. The SDGs were set up in 2015 by the UNGA and are intended to be achieved by the year 2030. The SDGs cover all dimensions of development, and you can see that from the slide, everything from poverty to clean energy, health, education, climate, etc. And given the SDGs are intended to be achieved by 2030, much work has been done to develop monitorable indicators for each goal. And the number of indicators to track performance under these 17 goals numbers around 240. This presents an unprecedented monitoring challenge for national governments, and there's widespread enthusiasm for big data's potential to support monitoring. And experience and use cases underscore the need for these innovative collaborations and partnerships that I'm about to describe. However, there is poor information sharing on how these partnerships can support SDGs monitoring, and that was really the motivation for the work that I'm going to present today. In terms of big data, we're really focused on the promise of it to implementation. Countries using big data sources can improve coverage, timeliness, and granularity of their official estimates while reducing production costs and respondent burden. The ease of using big data for SDG monitoring depends on the type of big data, the legal and regulatory context, and the institutional capacity. Developments over the past decade show how countries can use big data for statistical production and decision-making, and recent cases of countries experimenting with big data sources to support national SDG monitoring include the Philippines, Colombia, Ghana, among others. Now, I mentioned at the outset that we have a literature review that provides the foundation for how big data is currently being used for SDG monitoring. And the paper that you'll find on the website identifies and reviews 100 recently published data sets derived from big data, highlighting considerable coverage of the SDGs corresponding to the goals, targets, and official indicators. This diagram is a busy one, I'll give you that, but it outlines where big data is supporting SDG monitoring insofar as the academic and gray literature are concerned. And so let me just take a minute to take you through this slide. So you'll see the slide basically breaks down into the 16 SDG categories under which monitorable indicators have been identified. The 17th is about partnerships, so it really doesn't have many indicators at present. And the rectangles under each of these columns. So the first column would be SDG 1, sort of the elimination of poverty. The second column, which is sort of a beigey color, would be ending hunger, etc. You notice there's a series of rectangles under that and a diamond following that. And that indicates the number of indicators under each of these goals where big data has an application and is being used. So for example, under column 3 under health, there are an awful lot of indicators that benefit from big data. These are categorized by these 3-digit numbers that you can see on this slide. And it seems that about 75% of the SDG health indicators underlying the health goal can benefit from big data. By contrast, big data isn't so helpful for something like SDG 9, which is innovation in physical infrastructure, or it certainly isn't to date. Only about 8% of the indicators under this particular goal are at present using big data to track performance. So that gives you a sense of the range and the concentration of how big data is being used at the moment. And again, there's a much more information on the report that you can find at the website that I highlighted earlier. I also wanted to touch a little bit on the big data sources that underlie each of these goals. So here we have another complicated slide, again, much easier seen at our website. The outside circle represents the big data sources. So for example, you'll see some pretty large circles in the outer one, which correspond to Earth observation and satellite data. Some of the smaller circles on the outside are things like sensor data, tracking data, administrative records from other government entities, etc. And the inner circle really represents the now familiar, hopefully at this stage of the presentation, the 17 SDG data indicators. And you can see pretty clearly that satellite and Earth observation data was the dominant big data type. and is publicly available satellite imagery combined with cloud computing infrastructure has largely driven advancements in SDG applications. Turning to our partnerships, some NSOs and statistical organizations in government have yet to commence their big data journeys, while others are quite advanced. And this came through very clearly in the extensive interviews that we did. And so we came up with a formal maturity model that provides an intuitive framework for understanding the current state and progress of these organizations in terms of their ability to derive value from big data sources. And this is another very busy slide. And so I'm going to take a moment to break down the components. So basically, we think about a maturity as described by sort of three broad capability dimensions in a sort of a statistically an organization producing statistics. And on this slide, it's described by the three pink arrows kind of near the top of the slide. And the three of them are organizational capabilities. This is something that looks at the degree of big data awareness, big data literacy, the support by the senior management to develop inclusive ways of integrating big data into production processes. And we sort of think of this capability ranging from low to high. The second pink arrow is technical capabilities. And this describes both the human capabilities within the organization as well as its technical infrastructure. And here the capabilities range from limited to proficient. And then finally, we have governance. And this is the government capability, which is the legal and regulatory context that supports or inhibits big data use for official monitoring. And the capability ranges from weak to strong. So we assign each statistical organization into 6 stages of maturity, sort of based on where they stand on the spectrum of these 3 capabilities that I just mentioned: organizational, technical, and governance. And the sort of the stages of maturity in this figure are marked by the chevrons at the top of the slide. And they're entitled nascent, maturity, pre-adoption, early implementation, the dreaded chasm, proficient, and mature. The other thing that the slide describes is the type of external partner that can add value, and different combination of these external partners or different types of external expertise work best at different organizational maturity states. So here you'll see these defined in the sort of the rectangular components in the bottom half of the slide. And these external partners include data providers, for example, folks that are managing Earth observation equipment, analytical partners. Oftentimes there's a great deal of analytical work required to transcribe big data into usable statistical products. This sort of analytical expertise is often missing from statistical organizations in national governments. Technology partners, because obviously there is a technical requirement in order to process big data. Brokers and conveners. This is a kind of a type of an external partner that acts more as a trainer, a guider, a Sherpa to an organization to sort of help guide them through the implementation of big data in their statistical production activities. Since we're dealing with a development agenda, there's a lot of countries that don't have a great deal of financial resources to experiment with big data, and that's where donors can come in as an important external partner. We have legal partners because much of the issues can involve around data sharing agreements, modifying the legal and regulatory frameworks necessary in order to be successful at sort of generating a continual pipeline of big data into these production processes. And finally, and certainly not least important, are champions and sponsors, often domestic champions and sponsors, and often at the political or the executive level, the executive branch leadership of government. And you can see a lot of examples of the importance of these types of champions and leaders when we look at the open data movement in government that took place about 10 years ago. So now, now that we've sort of given you a sense of how to interpret this slide, what did we find? So you'll notice that I've got sort of two rectangulars, red boxes around nascent or the earliest phase of maturity. And here it just highlights in the lower half of the slide, probably the types of partners that are most important at this stage of maturity. And so what we really have in the nascent stage, this represents almost a pre-big data environment in an organization producing national statistics. In this stage, the organization has a low awareness of big data, and the potential value of big data for official statistics production and SDG monitoring isn't that well known. And at this stage, the partnerships with knowledge brokers and convening organizations, which is represented by the 3 dots, because 3 is the most important in our scheme of describing the importance of each of these types of external expertise, is pretty much the only type of brokerage that we found to be, or sort of external partner, we found to be particularly important at this sort of pre-big data environment stage. When we move to sort of pre-adoption, then you see that more partners become more important and more critical to supporting the organization on its big data journey. Here in the pre-adoption stage, the organization is starting to explore big data analytics, and its mindset is around experimentation. However, broad-based support from leadership is still lacking. Partners to find financing for big data products, including from international donors or government allocations, are really important. And partners to advise on legal frameworks also become critical. As we move into early implementation, we find that pilots of sort of test driving big data in these circumstances are more established, and government is collecting big data from data providers in different formats and investing in necessary infrastructure. Technical and analytical partnerships provide services to complement and build in-house capacity, and steps are taken to support the recruitment and retainment of in-house data science capabilities. So you see that almost all types of partnerships are essential here, which is kind of an interesting finding. As our organizations move from early adoption to mature, they need to overcome a chasm. This is well documented in the literature. Pilot applications have been deployed, but capability, governance, and sustainable funding gaps remain. And moving forward requires big data projects to be planned and budgeted on par with statistical production and existing data integration programs. And then finally, we move to sort of proficient and mature levels of maturity. And at this organization, at this stage of maturity, the organization has well-established big data programs that are executed and budgeted. Partners for brokering and to find financing are no longer needed, but partners with data providers and technology expertise remains very, very important. And so we're trying to find a way to summarize these findings, and we did so in this following schematic. Here you can sort of find the 5 practical steps that we've identified to harness big data for SDG national monitoring. And these practical steps are really on the circumference of this great circle. And in the middle, again, we're just reiterating the types of external partnerships that are required. You saw this on the last slide. So the core of the circle has our providers, data providers, analytical partners, technology partners, et cetera. And then if we start at the top of the outer circle of this diagram, one of the practical steps is getting big data partnerships off the ground. And here we would recommend convening a national dialogue on big data, invite experts from across sectors to explore real-world use cases, and finding a big data champion with influence in government to help raise awareness. Working our way around, we can kind of see things like building a business case and aligning incentives. A range of partners are often necessary, developing the business case. And this includes the statistical organization itself, data providers, regulators, technical service providers, privacy officers, and legal advisors. Navigating the governance and regulatory landscape requires engaging with data privacy agencies in government if they exist, regulators, and again, legal counsels, and building trust with partners at this stage, we found to be quite crucial. Building the technical and human capabilities is an important practical step through partnerships with multidisciplinary teams comprising of subject matter experts, data scientists, statisticians, computer scientists, among others, to harness big data sources. And then finally, sustaining big data partnerships require in-house organizational capacity, and we recognize, and certainly the experience that we've cataloged recognizes, that this capacity development takes time and needs to be backed by ongoing programs that are planned and budgeted with secure funding. Data providers, analytical providers, technology providers, and donors will therefore be critical in supporting the NSOs to cross the chasm towards big data proficiency. So I just want to sum up where I started. I would like to thank you for your attention today during this session. I hope you found it useful. Again, you know what the main findings are: that measuring progress on development is a challenge. Big data holds promise for monitoring national progress on development, key development issues. National statistical organizations and statisticians must partner with external entities to gain access to data and technical capabilities. Partnerships that work best are determined by a maturity model, and we've tried to highlight that incorporating big data into statistical processes take time and more than just technical know-how. And so I'm just scooting back to the very slide that I began with here, just to remind you that more can be found at our website. We would encourage you to go to www.bigdatasdgs.com to find out more about this information. I'd like to thank you for your attention again today, and I hope you're enjoying the rest of the conference. All the best.